Okay, there we go. Okay, so we'll start on page 8.2, and we'll talk about currency exchange rates. And what we'll do, we're looking at Chilean pesos and Japanese yen and asking, and what we want to understand is why are currencies exchange rates, why are they valued the way that they're valued? That's a very important thing to understand. Many times we think about currency rates and just think it's some magic, but it's not. The currency rates are affected by trade, by trade between countries and the value of the goods that they buy and sell from each other. So that's the basic reason for currency exchange rates. So what we're saying here is that if households and firms, this is page 83, households and firms holding Chilean pesos demanding Japanese yen, why would they do so? If they want to import products from Japan into Chile, they have to buy yen. If they want to travel to Japan, then they have to buy yen to spend while they're in Japan. If they want to buy Japanese assets, if someone in Chile wanted to buy a real estate property in Tokyo, they would have to convert their Chilean pesos into Japanese yen. The same thing. Why would people want to sell Japanese yen to people who, and buy Chilean pesos? Why would they do that? Well, maybe they wish to import products from Chile into Japan. So that's that. If they're importing products from Chile, such as Chilean fish, we've seen Chile has a lot of raw materials. If a company in Japan, a manufacturing company, wants to buy raw materials, metals, for example, metal ore or other, say, copper ore from Chile, they need to exchange their Japanese yen for Chilean pesos. So again, it's kind of the same reason. And so what you have is a supply. There's a supply here. There's a currency trade in Japanese yen, a supply of yen. The people who hold yen, that's people here in Japan or other people who hold yen, who are the suppliers, and the demand are the people that want to demand yen. So there's a demand curve for yen and a supply curve for yen. And so the exchange rate, that is the equilibrium rate, and that is in this case, particular case here, it was 0.161 Chilean pesos for one Japanese yen. That's about 1/6. So you would need 6 pesos. At this rate, it's about 6 pesos to buy 1 yen. So that's the idea. And at that equilibrium rate, there would be that amount of yen purchased by people who want to buy yen. That's the amount of transactions that would take place. Now, what we want to think about is the effect of a balance of payments surplus. We've talked about the balance of payment. That has an impact on a currency value. If a country if there's a balance of payment surplus in Japan relative to Chile, that means that capital is going abroad. So that there's basically a shift in demand for Japanese yen relative to the peso. So that would result in that you need more. The value of in this case, there's a relative increase in the value of the yen relative to the peso, and so here the idea and so that's a shift in the demand curve. The demand for in this case for yen, there's a shift for Japanese yen relative to the peso. So the supply is constant. There's a constant supply here for peso. So the shift in the demand for yen to the right results in a relative increase in the value of the yen relative to the peso. And that's very typical that if a country has a balance of payment surplus relative to another country, that causes its currency the value of its currency to rise. So that's where there is an impact of a balance of payment on the exchange rate. It makes it produces more demand for the country's currency. The demand curve shifts out. Now the thing to remember is that currency exchange rates are always between two countries. You may think about the value of the yen, the value of the yen relative to say the dollar, but every pair of currency has its own value. So that's an important thing in mind. Sometimes you'll see the value of a currency stated in a basket of other currencies. So in other words, you may put a mix of currencies together. But when you ever have, even in that case, there's always a one-to-one relationship between one currency and another. It's always the value of one currency against another. So that's a very important thing to consider. But now it's possible to let's see here. We've talked about. I've just basically talked about that. I want to talk about the fixed and floating exchange currencies, or the mechanism by which exchange rates are determined. And this is very important because this has a very big impact on the flow of capital and trade in the world. The way that currencies the value of currencies are determined has a major impact on the way that the countries trade with each other. That's something that people may not usually think about, but this is one thing I want to emphasize and make very important, that it matters very much. And there's two types of currency, of ways in which currencies are determined. One is a fixed exchange rate. A fixed exchange rate is when two currencies are basically held constant, where the values of the currencies are in general not allowed to change in the short run. And the other is a floating, what's called a floating exchange rate, where the value of a currency is allowed to fluctuate in a market. Now, I've showed you here the idea that currencies exchange in a market, but they can also be fixed. And the thing is, the thing about a fixed exchange rate, it's achieved through the use of one or more mechanisms that may limit the balance of payment imbalance. So that's a very important thing, is that when you have an imbalance of trade or an imbalance of capital flow, then that changes the demand for of one currency to another. That affects the demand for currency of the two currencies. So if you have an imbalance and you have a fixed exchange rate, you have to do something to make the balance even. You have to make some way to make the balance even, or else the fixed exchange rate becomes artificial. And if it becomes artificial, then people begin trading it on what's called a black market. So black market trade is where there's a fixed exchange rate, and yet it's not a real, where that fixed exchange rate is not reflecting the real value of the currencies to each other. For example, the Chinese currency, the yuan, now floats a bit, but it's somewhat fixed. I recall, for example, the first time I went to China and walking around the street, and there was the fixed value of the currency, and then there was the real value of the currency. And the real value, since there was a real market value, but there was no market, people would come up to you on the street and try to sell you at the real market price, and offer currency at the real market price. And that's the way a black market operates. Other countries that have these kinds of currency exchange these kinds of controls where the price does not reflect what the market would actually have, then there's what's called a black market. But when you do have a fixed exchange rate, you either can have a trade you have to restrict trade, you can't allow trade, or capital controls. Then you have to control the flow of capital, or you control the flow of trade. Now, for example, China right now, there is a relatively fixed exchange rate. There's capital controls. China has very strong capital controls. They're very concerned about the value of their currency. Many people in China want to get their money out of the country. The government doesn't want them to do that, so they have capital controls. Another way that fixed exchange, that currencies remain fixed, is by the exchange rate is linked with a commodity, and the most common example is gold. And we'll see that's something called the gold standard. That is we have historically had what are called fixed exchange regimes, a fixed exchange regime, and we'll talk more about that later, that involve gold. And so what happens and as we'll talk more about this later, when you have an imbalance of trade and a fixed exchange rate, then one country has to send gold to the country that has the deficit. The deficit has to send gold. Has to have gold. Their central bank. They have a central bank, and the central bank sends gold to the other country. We'll talk more about that a little later. A peg is a special kind of fixed exchange rate. A peg. For example, normal fixed exchange rates, all currencies are fixed. So, for example, under the traditional gold standard, we'll see of the late 19th century and early 20th century, many currencies were fixed to each other. A peg is where one currency is fixed to another currency. And one of the best known examples of that is the Hong Kong dollar. If you've ever been to Hong Kong, the Hong Kong dollar is typically fixed to the U.S. dollar. So it's basically linked. It's all the Hong Kong dollar is basically linked to the U.S. dollar. So over time, there's very little change in the value of the currencies. Now, there's also an interesting thing about the Hong Kong dollar. The Hong Kong other countries, their central banks issue currency. In Hong Kong, those are private banks that issue the current. The Hong Kong dollar is issued by the banks themselves. That's a little bit different. Fixed exchange rates typically require some type of manipulation by a government or central bank. The thing about a fixed exchange rate, what people like, is that there's predictability. If I know that the exchange rate is going to be is the same, then it's easy for me to make contract if I know that between two countries, say the dollar and the yen are fixed, then I don't worry about a change in the value of the two currencies. So if I'm a business person that wants to sell goods or buy goods, I can make a contract in advance and be confident that the value of the currencies won't change. So that can help trade. That can make trade easier. So that's the stability and predictability. Although there can be, and again, you can have imbalances. Now, where floating currency exchange rates can make capital flows between nations more easy. It's more easy because you don't have trade restrictions or capital controls. So a floating exchange rate typically allows more trade and more capital flows. And we have the phenomenon that's called globalization. You've heard the term globalization. Globalization is something that happens. What that means is we've had we've had floating exchange rates since the early 1970s. And because we've had floating exchange rates and relatively free trade, so you have floating exchange rates and free trade and relatively flow of capital. So those things create what we call globalization. And so those things are all of those things come together. That's an important part of how things come together. Now, a very interesting thing, part of that, is that Japan, for example, had current capital controls until almost the mid-1980s. I believe it was 1984. So it was very hard to take money out of the country or to buy yen. The yen was fixed to the dollar. There were a lot of capital controls. And so actually, as a result of that, if you go look at Japanese trade data before 1984, and we'll see this a little later, there was a relative balance of trade because of the capital controls. You have capital controls. You have a trade balance. As we'll see a little bit later, the trade surplus of Japan occurred after. Most of that occurred after the capital controls were lifted by the Japanese government. Very interesting. And as we'll see, that led to the asset bubble of the late 1980s and early 1990s. Very much connected. And in fact, as we'll see a little bit later, actually the Japanese asset bubble was the beginning of a very dramatic imbalances in the global economy. Really, the Japanese asset bubble was the first real major wave in which we've had a very unstable, we've had a lot of instability in the global economy over the last 30 years, and so that's a very important event. And so we're going to study that a little bit later in this lecture. So what's interesting is the global financial system has experienced approximately equal amounts of fixed and floating exchange regimes over the past 130 years. The late 19th and early 20th century were fixed regime. Between the wars was a floating regime. For a time after the war was a fixed regime. And since the early 1970s, it's been a floating regime. Now what we'll see is that creates benefits and disadvantages within and between countries. One of the things that's also about arbitrage, then let me talk about it. Let me get up and talk about arbitrage. I've mentioned about arbitrage. One of the important things about arbitrage is that if you have three countries, let's say Japan, U.S., and the euro, actually three currencies, Japan, U.S., and the euro, and let's say if the currency, let's say that the yen to the dollar is 100, let's say they're all 100. So just to make it simple, let's say that they're all 100. If the U.S. if the U.S. and let's say it takes the yen to U.S. So this is yen over dollar. Let's say that goes to 110. Then that is actually going to affect these exchange rates as well, because then this currency, if the yen goes, then it needs more yen. The yen becomes cheaper, less valuable relative to the dollar. But that also has to happen to the euro. Then that also will change the value here. So all of these currencies are linked. And if values get, if there's an imbalance in the values, in other words, if the value of one currency, of these two currencies change and the other values don't change, then that's what's called arbitrage. That's an arbitrage opportunity. And in an arbitrage opportunity, somebody can buy one currency cheaply, sell another currency that's more valuable, and when that happens, then there's a readjustment. So basically, what happens if the yen goes to 110 to the U.S. dollar, it would also have to adjust to the euro. So if you're holding, if it's 100 euros to the dollar, or 100 euros to the yen, or yen is 100 yen to the euro, then you're going to have to, and there's a change here, there has to be a change here. And it changes because in the markets, there's arbitrage. There's arbitrage opportunity, and people can buy and sell these currencies in order to take advantage of the imbalance. So that then creates an equilibrium. So that is how, even though currencies are one-to-one, they're all linked. All of the currencies are linked because countries trade with each other, and there's capital that flows between each country. So that's also part of a floating exchange rate. A floating exchange, in a floating exchange, the currency rates constantly change. Because when they change between, when two countries, the currency changes to them because of something that happens between these two countries, then the rates between all the other countries have to change. And that's part of a floating exchange rate, and that's why you have a market. So the market does that. But if it's fixed, then it stays 100. And they all have to be fixed. They all have to be fixed. So that's one of the issues, is that when you fix a currency, that has to be fixed to all the currencies for that to make sense. So that's a very important thing to remember. Now, like what they did with the peg, what's different about the peg is, for example, the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar, but that means it floats against all the other currencies. So the Hong Kong government makes sure that to do the things that are needed to keep the Hong Kong dollar, the Hong Kong dollar and the US dollar the same. But that means that it has to float against all the other currencies. So that's the thing about a peg. When you have a peg, it's only the one-to-one and all the other currencies float. So that's also an important thing to keep in mind. Right, and here I talk about a currency peg takes place between a relatively minor currency, such as the Hong Kong dollar, and a currency generally considered to have what is called a reserve status. The reserve statuses are the major world currencies, and right now the major world currencies are the yen, the US dollar, of course, the most important, the euro, and the Japanese yen. And we'll see a few other countries have a little bit of importance, but much, much lower. Now, in terms of the, as I mentioned about the floating exchange rate, and as we'll see, there was a gold. Basically, the world was on essentially a gold standard until the early 1970s, and for various reasons, that changed in the early 1970s. One of the things about the fixed exchange regimes, as I say, requires more regulation. That's the important thing to remember. However you regulate it, that fixed exchange rate requires more regulation. A floating exchange rate implies that there's less regulation. It doesn't mean there's no regulation. Governments can get concerned if there's too much fluctuation, but there's typically less regulation. I mentioned just a moment ago about a reserve currency. A reserve currency is a currency held in significant quantities by government, central banks, and international institutions as a way to facilitating international payment. So let's say that countries, let's say that in terms of trade, for example, oil. Oil is traded in U.S. dollars. That's a commodity that trades almost only in U.S. dollars. I think Iran has tried to trade oil in euros. I'm not sure how successful they've been with that, but most of the world's oil, all transactions take place in dollars. So let's say if you're in Japan and you want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, you have to hold dollars. You have to have dollars. You can't take yen. I mean, you could, but if you took yen to Saudi Arabia would say, well, we need U.S. dollars. You can't exchange Saudi Arabian currency for yen in order to buy. You have to hold dollars. So what will typically happen is that the central bank of the Bank of Japan will hold U.S. dollars to make it easy for companies and companies here to acquire dollars in order to buy in order to use that to buy oil. So, and that's very typical. Much trade takes place in limited currencies, and so this is one of the reasons why central banks tend to hold what are called reserve currencies. In what's called the classic gold standard era of the late 19th and early 20th century, the British pound sterling was considered the world's reserve currency. So most trade was done in pound sterling, so that wherever you were, if between countries you bought and sold goods in pound sterling. So people countries had their central banks or their governments had to have holdings in pound sterlings. After World War I, and especially after World War II, the United States became the world's most important reserve currencies, and I have, and which it's had since the end of the Second World War. It's been the dominant currency as in terms of reserve status in the world. And so this was in 2015, and this gives a good example of that. The U.S. dollar in late 2015, about a year and a half ago, had 64% of allocated shares. That means where government said we're holding this much in specific currencies. The U.S. dollar was 64% of that. The euro 20%. Actually, the pound sterling. There's still there's still some. The pound great even though Great Britain has its status in the world has dropped. Britain still has important relationships with many of its former colonies. For example, and former colonies include India, Malaysia, Singapore, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. All those were former colonies, and they had so many of them have an important relationship, and so for trade between those countries in Britain, that may still be in pound sterling. So so trade between, and to some degree between those countries, the British pound may have still an important impact. So central banks can hold British pounds. Japanese yen is less important. That's probably for trade within Asia, and to some degree because the yen is an important global currency in terms of just the volume of transactions. There's a significant amount of transaction in yen because there's a lot of trade between Japan. Japan is one of the most important economies of the world. There's a lot of Japan has one of the largest trade flows with other countries in the world. So banks do need, it's important for banks to hold at least some yen, and certainly the currency market for yen is very large. It's a very big currency market. Canadian dollar and the US dollar, the Australian dollar, you wonder, well, why does that even have any? Remember we talked about how there's a lot of commodities that are sold by those two countries? Both Canada and Australia sell a lot of raw materials. So because of that, there's, in terms of the trade of raw materials, such as metals, coal, there's those central banks that involve with trade in Canadian and Australian raw materials there's some importance for banks to hold currencies, and that shows you the importance of Canada and the U.S. in terms of supplying raw materials to the world market. The Swiss franc is a very traditional, probably is lower than it used to be. The reason is that the Swiss bank, Switzerland has traditionally been a private banking center, and so people have held Swiss franc because of private banking reasons. Other currencies are less important. There's also what are called unallocated reserves, and that's 41%. Only 59% are these allocated shares. 41%. What that means is the government holding those doesn't tell you what currencies they're holding. Most of that's China. And China doesn't want to say what they're holding. Now, people have good guesses that most of it is dollars, and there's ways to get an idea of what that is. China is trying to be secretive about that for its own strategic and other reasons, but most of that is currency that's held by China, and the reason is that they've had a large trade surplus. A lot of trade. China has acquired a lot of U.S. dollars as a result of a big trade surplus with the United States. Although, and they just the Chinese central bank just doesn't say how much they're holding, but people know most of it's dollars. It's just a game that they're playing. Historical financial regimes. And the thing I want to point out is, why are we talking about this? Because this is understanding the financial regimes and is very important to understand trade and capital flows. So we've talked about the global economy. We talked about how countries become where wealth comes from, the way countries basically have become wealthy. So now we've talked about trade and the basis for trade and capital flows. And now we're going to talk about financial regimes that heavily impact the flow of trade and capital. We basically have seen six major financial regimes since the late 1880s. They are the classical gold standard from the 1880 to 1914. That was the beginning of World War I. That caused a major change in global trade. And what's interesting about that is that the onset of war, the amount of trade that when you had the gold standard, the amount of trade as measured by the trade flows as a percentage of world GDP was actually reached its peak just before World War I. And that volume of trade as a percentage of global GDP, it didn't reach that level again until the 1970s. So that was the impact that World War I and World War II had on global trade. It reduced global trade basically for more than 50 years, basically 2 generations, or almost 3 generations, that world trade was suppressed. So that's why we want to take a look at the gold standard. That was a very important part of global economic history. Although it seems like it's a long time ago, that has an impact now, and that we want to understand the benefits, the advantages and disadvantages of the gold standard. World War I caused a big change of that. Then there was what we call the interwar period, 1919 to 1939. Between the wars, the financial regime that existed then. World War II again was a major disruption in global trade. Then the post-war, the early post-war, was what was called the Bretton Woods period. That was based on what was called the Bretton Woods Agreement, which took place towards the end of the war. The war was still going on, but the major Allied powers met in 1944 and basically began setting up the post-World War II. They could see the war was going to end, that they were going to win the war, and they basically set up the world, began setting up the world economy in the post-war. Those were basically fixed exchange rates, and it was a somewhat of a gold standard. It was not the classic gold standard, but it was similar. It was basically based on gold. The floating exchange rate period is what's taken place since 1971. We've now almost 50 years of the floating exchange rates. We've seen a lot of advantages, huge increase in world trade. The world economy has grown dramatically, but we're seeing imbalances. It's also created major imbalances between countries, and it creates instability. Some of the instability that we're seeing now is political. We've seen, we saw the Brexit, for example, has been caused by the Brexit in Britain to leaving the European Union, is a consequence of this, as also the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. Whether you're a supporter or you're opposed to Mr. Trump being president, the fact is that these imbalances that are created by the floating exchange rate are to some degree creating this political upheaval that we're seeing in the world. So it's important, if you're interested in understanding the politics, well, it's important to understand the economic causes of that. So I haven't talked much about politics here, but this department is political and economic. But really, if you want to really deeply understand the political, you have to deeply understand. I will argue with you that you being in this class, you're going to have an understanding, even though we won't talk a lot about politics in this class, when you begin to connect these economy with political events, you begin to see you'll see the connections, and you're going to walk out of here probably with a deeper understanding of political events than you expected when you came in. So we'll want to keep that in mind in the back. And we'll begin with the classic gold standard. We're on page 91 if you're not there. A gold standard exists when the country fixes its currency to a specific value of gold. The value of the US dollar, for example, was fixed to gold at $20.67 from 1834 to 1933, a 100-year period. that if you had $20.67, you could go take that and buy gold from the U.S. government. You could freely exchange gold and U.S. dollars for that. So the U.S. dollar was on a gold standard over that time. At the same time, Great Britain fixed the pound at £3 17 shillings 10.5 pence. Don't worry about that. That's old. There was a very complicated way that Britain determined its currency. But because during that time, the British pound was fixed to gold. The U.S. dollar was fixed to gold, so that meant you could exchange back and forth. Then back and forth between the currency rate between the British pound and the U.S. dollar was also fixed, and that fixture was fixed at $4.867 dollars per pound. So during that period, 100 years, that was exactly fixed between that. So a number of other major currencies fixed their currencies to a specific amount per unit of gold during the 1870s. So think about what happened. So you've got, in 1870, you had had a long regime where the U.S. dollar is fixed at 2067 to 1 ounce of gold. That's what, 28 grams, something like 28 grams or something like that. So, and the pound, whatever that was. So $4.867 to 1 pound. So 1 pound was, is that 1 pound, and the pound was the major world currency. So the pound is the major world currency. The U.S. is fixed to the pound. So this is from 1833 on. So the early 1870s, other countries, particularly in Europe, began fixing their currency, their own currencies to the dollar. So they fixed. More countries started fixing to gold. So they established their currencies relative to gold. So when they did that, then they became fixed to the pound and to the dollar. So when these countries fixed their currency to gold, it automatically fixed their currencies to the pound and the US dollar because these currencies were fixed to gold. So that creates a fixed exchange regime. That means that all of the countries that are fixed to gold, they're all linked. They're all linked together. They're all linked. Every country is linked together. All of their currencies are linked. So they can trade between each other at a fixed exchange rate. Okay. So that's a very important thing to remember and consider when we think about that. So from about 1880, the currencies of most major nations were fixed to each other. So from about 1880, most major currencies were fixed to each other. And that's until the onset of World War I in 1914, so a period of about 35 years. The currencies were fixed. So what that does is it produces a relative price stability. You get price stability. It led to unprecedented and very rapid economic growth. The world saw an expansion of economic growth and trade that it had never seen in human history. So this was a great era of expansion of world economies and trade. There was also tariff reductions. Countries reduced their tariffs, so it encouraged trade. And as I said, there was a level of international trade and financial integration Also, financial integration is connected to that, as we talked. Current capital flow is also connected to that. Remember, we've talked about your net exchange rate, your trade exchange, your net balance affects capital flows. So that produced a level of financial integration in 1913 that was not realized till the 1970s. So let's think about how the gold standard works. Under the gold standard, currency values are fixed to gold, and currencies can be freely converted into gold. So what that means, you can convert to gold at the official exchange rate. So the total stock of gold grew at a slow rate. So basically, the world money supply was fixed to the amount of gold. So you have to go mine gold. So you mine gold, but there's a certain stock. Countries have had a certain amount of gold. Well, the amount of gold increases fairly slowly. That was basically the amount of currency. The global currency was a function of the amount of gold. And so what that means is also the total global money supply was fixed. Then the balance of payments were balanced through the adjustment of prices within countries. So here's how this system worked. So let's say we have two countries, A and B, and two goods, X and Y. And so let's just suppose national income is 10,000 units of each currency, and each country's central bank holds 10,000 units of gold. So think about that. There's each country holds 10,000 units of currency, which is linked to 10,000 units of gold. That's the important thing to remember, is the amount of currency is linked to the amount of gold that each country holds. Okay? So as a result, the value of each country's currency is fixed at 1 unit of currency for 1 unit of gold. So prices of X and Y are at prices, say PXA, PXB, and PYB, PYB. So price of X in country A, price of X in country B, price of Y in country A, price of Y in country B, at the currency rates in those countries. So let's suppose we have national consumption and incomes that are given by these equations. That means the price of good X in country A at the price at time T, times the price of times the amount of goods consumed in country A, plus the price of good Y in country A, times the amount of goods, is equal to the national income, is equal to 10,000. That's true in both countries. Now let's suppose that country A runs a balance of payment surplus with country B of 500 units, that they've sold more goods. They've sold more goods to country. They have a trade imbalance. They've sold 500 more units of goods to country B, to country B. We haven't talked about how that takes place. We don't need to worry about that. So what that means under the gold standard, country A has an excess of 500 units of country B's currency. Now, they can't use that currency within their country. But so what they need to do, since the currencies are fully convertible into gold, all of the countries that are linked are fully convertible to gold, then country B, because they have a trade deficit, in order to balance the trade deficit, they have to ship 500 units of gold to country A. Literally, take the gold, put it on a boat or a train, and ship it to country A. So that's how, then the money supply, what that means is the money supply in country A increases by 500 units, and the money supply in country B decreases by 500 units. Well, what that does then, so then that changes the national incomes. That changes the money supply in the two countries. So it's led to a change in incomes. But let's say that the price level in country A increases while the price level in country B decreases. But because the currencies are all fixed, the prices the prices change. But what that does is it increases that means in country A the prices go up, in country B the prices go down. But if the prices go up and they sold more goods to country B, the price of their goods is rise, so that it becomes less attractive. So because it becomes less attractive, then that'll balance out trade between them. Then the trade becomes balanced between the two countries because the price is higher. It becomes the country A's goods in country B become more expensive. So the volume of the imbalance is reduced. The prices rise enough, it balances out, and eventually then prices become equal. The trade becomes equal, so the trade becomes equal. That's just don't worry about exactly how that works. Don't you worry about trying to calculate all that out. The important thing is that you remember how the mechanism works. That gold flows from one country to the other. That increases the prices in country A. That makes less trade back to country B. There's eventually a balance of trade, which eliminates the flow. So that way, because of that flow of gold, the balances are maintained, and so there's relatively little inflation. It reduces inflation. And so there's almost no inflation. There's typically very little inflation. So there's a stability in prices. There's a relative stability there's a stability of currencies. So there's a predictability of currencies. There's a stability of prices. Overall stability. But short run, you get fluctuations. Because, as I said, your price goes up in the one country because they receive the gold. So with the country that receives the gold, they have a balance of payment surplus. So balance of payment surplus, that's balanced through a flow of gold. That increases prices. The short run, you have fluctuations. You have fluctuations. But over the long run, there's a relative stability of prices because it's all fixed in gold. So the prices have to stay stable over the long run. Short run, imbalances, gold flows between the countries. There's also, it's thought that there was more variability in output, and there's some people that think it leads also to a little bit more unemployment than under floating exchange rates. Those things aren't clear, but the point is that there's positives, and the positive is stable prices, stable exchange rates, but some fluctuation short run in prices. World War I changed everything. World changed after World War I. Huge, dramatic political and economic changes, especially in Europe. Europe saw the fall for example, there was an empire called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary, that was a single country. Now it's Austria and Hungary are two separate countries, but it was much bigger. What's now the former Yugoslavia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Parts of Romania and Bulgaria were parts of that. Were part. It was a big empire. It was a major world empire that broke up during World War I. The Ottoman Empire was a major world empire in 1914. The Ottoman Empire broke up. That was based in Turkey. Turkey was once the center of one of the greatest empires seen in the history of the world. That centered Turkey. Turkey once controlled almost all of the Middle East, all of what's now Iraq, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, all of the UAE, all of the Persian Gulf, all of northern Africa was once part of the Ottoman Empire and controlled by Turkey. So that was a great empire that broke up during World War I. And in fact, the political impact. This is just a political aside, but I think it's important. It's useful to talk about this. The political implications of World War I. We're seeing the effects now. The instability in the Middle East. The Middle East has been unstable since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and it's unstable now, and we're seeing that right now, the impact of that. And the terror that all of these terror attacks, Islamic terror attacks, have a link to you can trace these instabilities back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. So that's at any rate that was. But in terms of World War I politically, that saw the defeat of humiliation of Germany. It was the peak of Great Britain as a world power. The United States emerged as a world power after World War I. Japan became a significant global power. Became significant as a political power after World War I. Of course, as you know, I'm sure you know your Japanese history. Japan defeated Russia in 1905. That was really the emergence. That was had a major impact on bringing Japan to the internet as a significant international power, and that grew after World War I. Technology, we saw the emergence of mass production technologies, particularly in manufacturing, and the increasing use of electricity in manufacturing. Now, if you take this course in the second semester, we're going to talk a lot about technology and the effect of technology on economies. We're going to link that to that and financial crises. All of that's going to be linked. So if you stay around, you'll find that's going to be a very important theme. I'm introducing that now. We're going to talk more about that next semester. So just if you want to hang around for this class next time, you'll find that very interesting. Financial regime, stock market boom in the 1920s, driven by technology investment, particularly use of electricity, relatively unregulated financial markets. So that was the interwar period, 1919 and 1939. The end of the 1920s saw the collapse of the stock market and the onset of global depression, and a downturn that would last throughout the 1930s that led to economic instability, and that led to political instability. World War, this led to World War II. It first broke out in Asia, Japan and China, Europe by the end, and Europe later, all around the same time. Germany expanded. By the end of the decade, the world was once again engulfed in a war that would lead to a dramatic change in the world. The lessons of the 1920 boom and the 1930 Great Depression. The world discovered that unregulated financial markets were inherently unstable. Regulators looked for a regulatory balance. There was the enactment of the Glass-Steagall Act in the United States in 1933. Glass-Steagall is a very important, you'll want to remember that when you get up and write it because it is important. Glass-Steagall. Gold standard. Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall was legislation that separated out investment banking from commercial banking. So investment and commercial banking were separated. They couldn't, commercial banks were focused on lending, investment banks focused on transactions. They were completely separate. And because it was thought that the integration of that led to the financial instability and the Great Depression. So this is 1933 in the United States at the height of the Great Depression, and that stayed in place until 1999. And so that led to, at which time banks were allowed, investment and commercial banking was allowed to merge again. What happened right after that? The Depression, the Great Recession that we've seen in the past decade. So there's talk about bringing back Glass-Steagall in the United States. The new administration is talking about that, to separate out investment and commercial banking. So this is very much a topic now that's being, as to whether the world should re-regulate banking so that investment banking and commercial banking are separate again. Right now they're allowed to be mixed. Laissez-faire, laissez-faire is a French word. It means leave it alone. It means basically a lack of regulation. The instability in a war period caused policymakers to view stability as being the goal of society, and that the financial system had to serve the needs of the real economy and national economic development. Now, the interesting thing there is that we're starting to see that kind of talk again now. So there's really the talk, should there be more regulation? So these are things that these are, even though this is something that happened 80 years ago, this is very, very much, it's very much relevant to where we are right now. The realization of the interconnection, the international monetary system, the financial system, the interconnection of the banking system and the balance of payments, these things were realized, and that the balance of payments imbalances could lead to exchange rate and macroeconomic instability, and also political instability. We're seeing some of these same things right now. The Great Depression of the 1930s and what we've seen, the Great Recession of the last 10 years, are very similar, very, very similar events. It had very similar causes and very similar consequences. And so we're now very, and that's a question now. Is anyone following what's going on in the Middle East now? You've seen what's happening with Qatar? This is a very major event. If you haven't read much about them, maybe you've just heard a little bit about it, you'll want to go and find out a lot more about what's going on there. Qatar has been, remember I talked about Al Jazeera? The network, Al Jazeera, it's a very good source of news in English. It's from Qatar. That comes from Doha. Now, the countries around Qatar, especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have cut off relationships with Qatar. They're saying that Qatar has to change. Qatar has funded groups such as Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is very important in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt. The Hamas is important in Palestine. Also Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon. These other governments are saying stop funding these. And this is being led by the United States. When Donald Trump just made a trip to Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago, and he told the Saudis to tell Qatar not to stop. So now they're telling them that. Iran backs Qatar. Okay. This is Iran backs Qatar. Why do we care about that? Why do we care? about that? Do you think we should care? Do you think we should care about it? The answer is we should care a lot about it. Why? We're not. No, we don't get a lot. This country doesn't get a lot of oil from Qatar. We get a lot of gas. Now the gas is flowing now. And one of the things that I looked at, and I looked, well, what's going to happen to the gas? The gas right now, it's still flowing. Other trade, it's affecting trade with the flow of food, for example, into Qatar is being cut off. Air travel into Qatar is cut off. Qatar Airways is a major world airline. Major world airline. Qatar is going to have to get its food from Iran across the Gulf. But Qatar is a major supplier of gas to Japan. Major supplier. Countries, the two countries that are significant suppliers of gas to Japan are Qatar and Brunei. It's very compared for their small size, they're major suppliers. You want to pay attention to this. This matters to this country. So this is one of these things, the links of global events. What's going on there now? You want to be watching the news every day. It has an impact here. We're not separated from that. We're a part of that. Any rate, let's get back to the story. Bretton Woods, and we are still recording. I can see that now. We're still recording, so this is all getting. At least the voice here is going to be the most important part of this. The Bretton Woods Conference was held at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States in 1944. All of the 44 Allied nations took part, and it laid the groundwork for the global economy in the post-World War II era. And the system that was created from that was fully implemented by the late 1950s, and it lasted until 1971. They were fixed but adjustable currency exchange rates, with currencies fully convertible into gold and tied to a gold dollar peg. Now, the gold standard to pre-World War I was the countries were fixed to gold. This was a little bit different. The currencies were fully convertible into gold, and they were pegged, but it was a gold standard because they were all pegged to the U.S. dollar. So they were pegged, each country pegged its currency to the US dollar. They were fully convertible into gold. That led, so there were adjustment obligations on the part of all parties to create exchange rate stability and promote international trade. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and long-term development finance with the World Bank, and which was the World Bank, which was established in 1944, was done to create stability. And of course, after the war, both Germany and Japan were brought into this as part of creating this stability. There were national level financial regulation and limited capital account and exchange controls. So there was a constraint on short-term cross-border capital flows. They wanted capital flows, but not what we call hot money. Right now, under floating exchange rate, you can have as much hot money, short-term, that can flow. And we'll see hot money can create a lot of instability. So they didn't want hot money. So their cross-border capital flows. As I mentioned, Japan had capital flows until 1984. It limited the amount of short-term capital flows, but it also it reduced trade imbalance. There was relatively open trade but closed finance except for currency convertibility. It's a system where you do have trade, but it's less open. The importance was stability and smooth adjustments to balance of payment imbalances. So there were smooth adjustments. You wanted to keep relatively small imbalances. That meant that your net exports, your NX, your net exports were relatively low. So trade was relatively in balance. That's what you're trying to do, is create a regime where trade's in balance, capital flows are allowed, but everything is fairly limited because you're focused on stability. So that was the regime that took place in the post-war era. It was also to allow the world to recover from the war. The way this was done was the main way that this was done was the structure where the U.S. dollar maintained a parity of $35 to an ounce. So the U.S. dollar was officially linked to gold. The other currencies were basically a peg to the U.S. dollar. So they had it was an effective gold standard. It was what you could call it a soft gold standard. So the U.S. intervened in the gold market so that there was to maintain that fixed rate. So the U.S. dollar was fully during this era until 1971. You could take U.S. gold, you could take dollars and buy gold. So that maintained that currency stability. But it requires a lot of effort by the countries that participate in order to maintain that stability. But central banks and national governments, they often have incentives under a fixed exchange rate system to bend the rules and the problems are, here's the problems that can cause a country's underlying exchange rate to move away from its value in a fixed currency exchange rate. One is a change in relative price levels. If the rate of inflation in country A is higher than in country B, then the value of country B's currency should rise relative to country A. That's a very important thing to remember, is that, for example, let's say the last 25 years, inflation in the United States has generally been greater than in Japan. So if inflation is higher, let's say in the US than it is in Japan, then the value of yen should rise relative to the US dollar. Now, if you have a fixed exchange rate, if it's fixed, that can put strains on that, because the one current, if you have different inflation rates, then that puts pressure on a fixed exchange rate. If there's differences in relative economic growth rates, if the rate of economic growth rate in a country A is higher than country B, then country A's currency should rise relative to in general. In general. If interest rate is higher in country A than in country B, then country A's currency should rise relative to country A. Why? Because if the interest rates are higher, then you'll want to, then let's say if currency rates are fixed and a country A, the interest rates are higher, well, I want to get that country A's currencies and buy that instrument of that affects the interest rate, because I can get a higher return. And if the currency rates are fixed, but I can get a higher return, well, I'll just go to that country. I'll go to that country, buy that country's currency, and I'll get a higher return on my investment. It's a higher fixed return. So. But that puts pressure, because then it increases the demand for that currency. Because I have to sell the one currency to buy the other currency. But the exchange rates are all fixed. They're pegged. They're supposed to maintain that. So you can see that if any of those things get out of line, it begins to put pressure. Any of those things get out of line, it begins to put pressure And so you can see that's the source of instability in a fixed exchange rate. And so what happened was that during the 1960s, there was the growth of an offshore euro currency market. And so there was a market that was established outside. The U.S. regulators couldn't control it. And so there was expansion of credit in Europe. And so this began stimulating increase in cross-border capital flows, so you began to get interest rate differentials, increases in cross-border capital flows. There was an expansion of credit. The system began becoming unstable. Also, there was a balance of payment deficit to 1971. There were, because of capital outflows. A lot of that in the early post-war, that was aid from the U.S. to finance global economic recovery. Have you heard of the Marshall Plan? There's the Marshall Plan. You may know about the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was designed by the U.S. to help the European and Japanese. It was aid given to both Europe and Japan in order to help those countries recover from World War II. That was a capital outflow. That created a balance of payment deficit. But in the 1960s, that was dominated by private investment flows. So by 1971, you had great imbalances, inflation in the United States, dollars held overseas, the excess of U.S. dollars held overseas. It led to a collapse of the fixed exchange rate system. It's very detailed. I just want you to understand that there was imbalances, to understand where the imbalances come from and why why it could lead to a collapse of the fixed exchange rate system. What that meant was the U.S. was taken off of the gold standard, and the price of gold was allowed to float. So the price of gold was allowed to float, and this in turn it instantly created the need for a floating exchange rate system. So the world has been on a floating exchange rate system since 1971. So that's led, and I've talked about the major financial crises in the world since 1971: the Latin American crisis, Japanese asset bubble, the Asian financial crisis, and the global financial crisis and Great Recession. I think basically the Latin financial crisis in the end at the time it seemed like a major crisis. It's really a lot less important. I have these notes here. I lectured on this last year, but I'm going to just skip that. Unless if you're interested in Latin America, I'll be happy to work with you if you want to talk about that. I had a student last year that talked about Brazil, and so it was important for her to go over the Latin American crisis. But I think it's something we could skip unless you're really interested in Latin America, and I'll be happy to talk with you about it. But I think I'd like to spend more time and introduce the Japanese asset bubble. Now, of course, for us here living in this country, that's important. But I think it's really historically, it's very important to understand. I think it's important to understand the instability in the global economy now. I think it's really important to understand the Japanese asset bubble. Now, personally, because I came to this country in 1992, 25 years ago this month, and that was really the collapse, the bubble economy. The real collapse started literally as I came to this country, and it had a major impact on this country. It had a major impact on my life as well, because the things that I did, especially for the next 15, 17 years, had a major effect. The what happened because of the collapse of the bubble had a major impact on what I did, the work activities that I did in this country for much of the time that I've lived here. So it's personally, it's the study is very important, but it also has global impact. So it's important to understand. So not just understand the economy of this country, but also it has a major impact, had a major impact on the world economies. It was one of the great asset bubbles of history, one of history's great asset bubbles. And now 25 years have passed since the collapse of the asset bubble, but it's really continues to impact the Japanese economy, and I would argue it still impacts the global economy. And it also, the Japanese asset bubble played a significant role in the Asian financial crisis. So if you're interested in other Asian countries, any other Asian country, particularly Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, were all had a huge impact in the financial crisis of 1997, and in turn, as we'll see, the Asian financial crisis led ultimately to the tremendous reform of the Japanese economy. You can't understand the reform of the Japanese economy without understanding how the Asian financial crisis forced, basically created the insolvency of the Japanese banking system and led to tremendous reform and change in the Japanese economy. At any rate, the first thing I want to do is talk about the balance of payments as a percentage of GDP between 1955 and 1988, and we've come to an end right there. We'll have to close at that. I'll give you your next assignment. I'll take a look. I'll get caught up on that with your. I saw messages, so I think I've received that. So I'll confirm that with you. I'll send out your. I'll get back to you on that in terms of that. In terms of your next, I'll want you to. Part of that will involve the use of national account data. I want you to get some exercises to get familiar and comfortable with that as a source of data, and to understand how to use the national accounts data. And also I want you to start thinking about your research and presentation. Now I want you to start getting active on what topics you want to do, and to begin really focusing your efforts for the rest of the semester on your research and creating your presentation for the class at the end of the semester. So we'll close there, and we'll start next time on the asset bubble. It's a fascinating story, and not just because of this country. I think it's a really fascinating story about asset bubbles, and as we'll see, the world has had asset bubbles blow up and burst since then, and I think we're still in asset bubbles now, and as we'll see, it's a direct consequence of floating exchange rates. So it's a very interesting story, and I think a very important part of the story of this class. So I look forward to presenting that to you next time, and we'll go over that in the next class. Thanks.
Thank you.